Okay, thank you, Mike. First of all, I'd like to thank the E.S.F, Mike and Linda, for allowing me to present today. I would also like to thank Bima for her, for her amazing experiences and some of the connections she's made over the years with regard to Kundalini research. And first of all, what I would like to do is to discuss what Kundalini is, as I best understand it, or as I understand it best. Because once we understand what Kundalini is, then we can have a better idea of how it relates to healing. So first slide, if you will, please, Mike. So what is Kundalini? The fact of the matter is that Kundalini does not fit into the modern Western paradigm of reality that is held by modern science. And by modern science, I mean orthodox science. That aspect of science, or that group of scientists who regard anything that cannot be measured or detected physically as having no existence. Now, the crux of the matter really comes down to consciousness. And as far as science is concerned, consciousness is simply a consequence of electrochemical activity in the neurons of the brain, no more, no less. When we die, it's gone, it's extinguished. But all the great spiritual traditions of the world have a very different viewpoint on that. Next slide, please. My focus has been on the Indian spiritual tradition because it just attracted me very much when I first read about it. And I tried to learn as much as I could over the years. One of the very first ideas that came out of the Indian spiritual tradition back about 1000 BC was the idea of Brahman, or ultimate reality. Now, Brahman is not an easy concept for most people to get any kind of a grasp of, because it is beyond time, space, and causality. It has no physical attributes. Now, the ancient sages realized that our minds really have almost no ability to understand something like that. In fact, our minds tend to work in a dualistic way. We think of things as in dualistic terms, good and evil, left and right, up and down, positive and negative, static and dynamic. And so in order to make this ultimate reality a little bit more comprehensible to our poor finite brains, what they did was they said it can be understood as having a dual aspect. And the static aspect, which is an infinite consciousness, which is again beyond time and space, it is unchanging. They referred to as the male deity Shiva. The dynamic aspect, which changes in time and space, is a creative power, an infinite creative power, and they referred to that as the female deity Shakti. And all the various philosophical systems of India from the time of the Vedas have actually been trying to express different ways of understanding that particular way in which reality works. Next slide, please. So the various different systems have many different ways of understanding this. And in fact, for instance, the Tantric system has a set of 36 different levels or tattvas existing between pure consciousness and physical matter. The Sankhya system has 24, and this is a little bit boggling. What I have done for my own purposes and to make it easier for myself to understand is I've sort of collapsed these down into 4 different, what I call aspects of Shakti. And for those of you who wish to explore this further, you can order my book, and it gives a much better explanation than I can present in a few minutes here. The very first aspect of Shakti that must come into operation is Maya Shakti. And in Maya Shakti, a spark of this infinite consciousness is collapsed to a point, and it is veiled from its own true infinite nature. So it does not realize that it is infinite. This is what Maya is. It is the veiling of consciousness from its own true nature. From this point of consciousness, the physical reality is projected. Next slide, please. This one should be Prakriti Shakti. Prakriti is a term from the Sankhya system, which means the phenomenal universe or nature. And just to briefly describe it, it says that from consciousness First is projected our mind, then our senses, and then sensible matter. And I could go into a lot more detail about this process, but again, time does not really permit, so I will just leave it at that. Next slide, please. Now, if that was all there was to this process, then the universe would be just a sea of dead and sentient matter. There would be nothing else. But the last two aspects of Shakti that I'm going to talk about have to do with life, because life is, as Linda pointed out, it is miraculous. Science really cannot explain it. You know, it is beyond the comprehension of science at this time. And Prana-Shakti is a bit of a difficult concept. For one reason is the term prana is used in, I think, at least 4 or 5 different ways in the Indian tradition. Most of those ways that it is used have to do with what I call individual prana, which is kind of like bioenergy or chi. It is the energy we can feel in our bodies. What I'm talking about here is different. It is what is called universal prana. And universal prana is of the nature of pure consciousness and intelligence. It has no physical component whatsoever. And it is this universal prana which controls and directs and really runs the entire physical body, from major physical systems like digestion and the healing, the immune system, which is involved with healing, all the way down to the cellular level. And back in 2012, I saw a video animation of DNA being replicated, and I was absolutely flabbergasted. And from that time, I started studying microbiology, and I realized very quickly that although science has done a tremendous amount of research and understanding in terms of what the physical processes are that go on inside cells and inside our body, they really have no idea whatsoever of how it is all controlled and directed and coordinated. It's astounding what happens. These processes that go on inside a cell, for instance, they are not simple, slow, linear processes. They are blindingly fast, dynamic, complex processes. And by dynamic, I mean depending on what happens at one stage, something happens in this or that. It's very flexible, you might say. And I could not understand how anyone could look at these processes and go, this is all just pure, blind, random chance. This is all just mechanical. If human beings designed a factory that was even 1% as amazing as what goes on inside a cell, it would be called a marvel of creative intelligence. But science says, oh, no, it's just a mechanical system. So anyway, next slide, please. Now the primary, I guess you would call modus operandi of Prana-Shakti is the maintenance of the body. It's responsible for the ongoing operation of all the various systems in the body, as I said, like the immune system, digestion, circulation, and activity right down to the cellular level. The last aspect of Shakti is Kundalini-Shakti, and its modus operandi is different. It has to do with creation. And there are 2 spheres of operation of Kundalini-Shakti. One of these is the individual, inside the individual, and the other is on the global level, and it has to do with the evolution of the species as a whole. Now, within the individual, there are 2 different phases of this operation that happen, and one of them has happened to every single one of us. Next slide, please. This happens when an ovum is fertilized, and from the time that happens until the baby is born, a most amazing process happens. You have a single cell, and then 9 months later you have a living, thinking, breathing human being composed of about 1 trillion cells of several hundred different types, all working in almost near perfect harmony. And this is a feat of assembly and construction which is beyond anything that we can even remotely conceive of. Now, if you were to ask most people, scientists and otherwise, well, how does this happen? The stock answer is the genetic code. Well, it's the genetic code. As Rupert Sheldrake likes to say, genes are highly overrated. And one thing that really amazed me when I started studying microbiology was that genes, the information in the genes, are used to assemble proteins, enzymes, and things like that from amino acids. And virtually that is all that the information in them does. If you were to ask a geneticist, well, where is the information that describes the form of a human being? They would have no answer. It's just not there. How is it that the same genes that are used in the construction of a hand are also the ones that are involved in the construction of a foot? They're different. How is it? What is it in terms of the sequence of this construction? How is this coming to it? Because if you look at a human body being constructed, it goes in a very specific sequence. One step must finish before another must begin. Where is the description of that process where it says what steps are to be taken? It just is not in the genes. And so I looked at this and I thought, this is absolutely boggling that that we can have something like this happen by pure blind random chance. So at the end of this process, we have a baby that is born, and at this point, Kundalini-Shakti goes into what is called the dormant stage. Next slide, please, Mike. And depending on the person's heredity, on their spiritual practices, on their lifestyle, on many different factors, I guess their diet, all sorts of different things, Kundalini-Shakti may become active again later in the person's life. But instead of trying to manufacture a brand new human being in the womb, what it does is it tries to refashion our nervous system and our brain so that our brain can manifest or can function at a much higher level. And it is in this higher level of functioning that we have what is called the faculty of enlightenment. So enlightenment is really the next step in evolution of the human race, which eventually, hopefully, all members of the species will come into. In the same way that the intellect, in all likelihood, probably evolved in a very gradual way in different individuals and then eventually became an aspect of the entire species. So for the last part of my talk, I would like to talk about the oral tradition of Kundalini and some of the actual physical processes. Thank you, Mike. The oral tradition has been around for many, many centuries. I have to confess that I don't know how many, but it has been a long time. In this tradition, knowledge of Kundalini has been passed down from teacher to disciple, and they have experimented with these techniques and on how to awaken Kundalini, how to understand it. The oral tradition, of course, does not have modern physiological knowledge behind it, so it is more concerned with function. And for those of you who are interested in the oral tradition, I cannot recommend more highly the book Kundalini Vidya by Joan Shiva-Pita Harrigan, who has founded the Kundalini Patanjali Yoga Care Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. So for those of you who really wish to understand the oral tradition that Joan has been a part of for many years, I would highly recommend reading this book. Now, in the oral tradition, one of the concepts that is very much a part of this tradition is that of the nadis. And nadi in Sanskrit means a conduit or a channel. And it is actually a conduit of the individual prana. And in the body, there are said to be many, many thousands of these nadis. Some say as many as, I think, 72,000. Now, of these nadis, there are 5, according to the oral tradition of Kundalini, that are said to be ones that Kundalini will operate in when it becomes awakened or comes into activation. Of these 5, there are 2 that lead to what Joan calls, they are culminating nadis. They lead to a culmination of the process. If the process goes to culmination, then the person has the potential, and I emphasize the word potential, to achieve final enlightenment. Of course, this does not happen to all people who have this activation, but it at least has the potential to go there. And my concern, because of the topic we're dealing with here in the Conference of Healing, is with what happens when Kundalini-Shakti becomes active in the other 3 non-culminating nadis. Non-culminating means that the process cannot go to completion. Next slide, please. In the non-culminating nadis, what happens is Kundalini goes into these nadis, but it can't escape, and it tends to go into a sort of a feedback loop. And what can happen is the person who is having an experience of this type can have peak experiences, mystical experiences, psychic abilities, highly enhanced creativity. They can be creative geniuses. They can have powerful charisma. There are many positive aspects to some of these. However, because Kundalini-Shakti cannot exit this, it gets stuck and it goes into kind of a loop in these nadis. It tends to deplete the nervous system of endorphins. I think that's how Joan puts it. It depletes the endorphins in the nervous system. And the result is that this feedback loop causes a sense of craving for stimulation. And this craving can be for virtually anything. It can be for power. It can be for spiritual experience. It can be for substances. So we have some of the things that happen with these experiences are substance abuse. We have obsessive compulsive disorder, sexual addiction. There's just almost unlimited the number of difficulties that can come up in the physical, emotional, and mental sphere as a consequence of this, what you might call the stuck process. Now, the only way that this can be corrected is for Kundalini to be diverted into a culminating nadi. And Joan outlines, I guess, 3 major ways in which this process can happen. One of the most important is a balanced, healthy lifestyle. And this means that the person eats nutritious foods, has a balanced diet, adequate exercise, low stress, basically everything that we think of as something that we would like to have in our life, really. But this is one of the most important factors, is a balanced, healthy lifestyle. The second thing which can help tremendously is for the person to devote themselves, at least part of their time, to service and helping other people in whatever way that suits them the best, because this helps to reduce the ego. And the third thing that can happen, which you might say is a part of the spiritual practice, is a sense of surrender to the divine will. And for those of you who are familiar with Bill W., the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, he had this white light experience when he reached the absolute bottom of his misery. He surrendered completely and totally to divine will. And he had this amazing white light experience. And this is Kundalini shifting into a culminating nadi. Now, it doesn't have to be that distressing for people, to have this happen. But it is important for people to understand what has to happen and the things they can do to accomplish it. So the last slide, please, Mike. In conclusion, I would first like to point out that, as I said in my description of Prana-Shakti, that Kundalini is running our bodies from top to bottom, every single cell. So it stands as a matter of being obvious that Kundalini is what is responsible for the running of the immune system and healing in general. As far as spiritual healing, I would say that one of the most important things in terms of spiritual healing is, as I said earlier a few minutes ago, about a healthy, moderate lifestyle, especially for people who are having problems with Kundalini. It's important for them to maintain this lifestyle and to have the realization that Kundalini is in charge. It is what is in control. And if we try to ignore it or to frustrate it or to subvert it, it will only make things more difficult. So it is really important for a person in that going through an experience of that kind to understand that Kundalini is in control and they have to cooperate with the process. And with that, I will end my presentation. And again, thank you to Mike and Linda and the E.S.F.